Hello, my name is Susu. This is the Procrastinator. This is my very first booktube video, and I have two disclaimers. One, if you've noticed, I am indeed on the floor, and that is because I've just moved to the States and there's no furniture in my house. And second, if I keep looking elsewhere and not into the camera, please excuse me. This is my first time filming anything, so I think it's gonna take some time getting used to. Anyway, this is my wrap up for the month of July. I had a great reading month. I read 9 books. I liked all of them. I even had 4-star reads, which is quite rare for me. So yeah, let's get right into it. So the first book I read is Thin Girls by Diana Clark. Trigger warning for descriptions of eating disorder. If you have any susceptibility to any description of eating disorder, please stay a mile away, because the way the author describes it in this book is so hyper realistic and so knowing. So the protagonist is a young woman named Rose, who develops an eating disorder for a myriad of reasons, to fit in with the popular girls, to differentiate herself from her twin sister. But what I liked about this book is it describes how ultimately purposeless eating disorders become. You don't do it to become fit or thin or beautiful. At some point it becomes this overwhelming obsession whose raison d'etre is just the disease itself. So the first 2/3 of the book is this really gritty, unflinching look at how devastating the effects of eating disorders can be. But the rest of the book is a story of recovery, a really authentic, hard-earned story of recovery. It could so be easily done in a cheesy way, but it wasn't at all. It really described well how after a long period of suffering, if you do get lucky, one day the sun may come up. The recovery felt really authentic and really uplifting. It was so well done. Other themes in this book include repressing your sexuality, wasting your life, years of your life to mental illness, hurting the people you love, the effects of trauma in your body. There's a lot going on, but it was all very well done, so highly recommend. The second book I read was also a home run. It's The Netanyahus by Joshua Cohen. The book was based from Joshua Cohen's time with the late Harold Bloom. Joshua Cohen would get together with Harold Bloom. They would trade literary gossip, and then in turn Harold Bloom would tell Cohen about his time with all the famous writers and all the famous literary superstars. And then one day Harold Bloom talked about a time when an academic by the name of Ben Zion Netanyahu visited his campus. So Harold Bloom hosted this academic, and yes, it is that Netanyahu, Bibi's father to be exact. And I feel so this is a very heavily fictionalized version of that event in Harold Bloom's time. I feel like 80% of the book's potential audience already are hooked, because like with this premise, how could you not? Anyway, this was an amazing read. It was really well written. It's part academia comedy. Think the likes of Kingsley Amis' Lucky Jim. It's hilarious. There's a hilarious bit involving like recommendation letters, and at one point it almost becomes like slapstick comedy, because the Netanyahus are depicted as being very rambunctious, uncouth, they're very present physically. And I know there's a controversy about how it comes across as too stereotypical for some people, but I don't think it's my place to judge, so please judge for yourself. So there's a lot of comedy, but it's also a very sober reflection on Zionism, identity, and history. It's a heavy topic, but Joshua Cohen does it with such a deft hand that at no point it becomes too heavy, too academic, too pontificating. Oh, and since this book takes place in the 1950s, there's a lot of anti-Semitism, which Cohen depicts with a light hand, but to really great effect. For example, the protagonist has a private joke with himself about the Church of Assumption, which he invokes whenever there's like a misunderstanding or misguided efforts at understanding between Gentiles and Jewish people. In the protagonist's words, "Whenever anyone presumed upon my Jewishness or presume to prevail upon me by appealing to my Jewishness. So it's really funny stuff. It's really well written, and it has a singular premise. Like, where else are you gonna go to get a book of this topic? So it's collected a lot of buzz, deservedly. But if you haven't read it yet, please do. It's so good. The next book I read is Yamasfarians by Alex McEvoy. I gave this 3 stars. It was a solid, entertaining, very contemporary read. The protagonist is a former social media influencer who has fallen from grace. She has grouped up with her childhood friend to run a camp to heal men from toxic masculinity. The premise is that all over the United States, men have been suddenly afflicted with a disease whereby they spontaneously gather into hordes and either help people or wreak havoc. So the gimmick is that the protagonist and her friend is going to heal men from this horde disease, which will hopefully catapult them into stardom. As I said, it's a very entertaining read. There was not a boring moment in sight, and at its core, it's a wry, ironic look at toxic masculinity. And I think I gave it 3 stars because it didn't go beyond much. That the book would wryly, ironically point at toxic masculinity, and you go, haha, but then what? I feel like the book was almost like an Onion article come to book form, which means it was very entertaining, but it didn't go beyond much that. But I feel it's definitely one of those books that can take you out of a reading slump. It was very entertaining, so check it out if it sounds something you'd be interested in. So the next book I read is Catch the Rabbit by Lana Bastasic, translated from Cerebral Creation by the author herself. The book is primarily about 2 things: female friendship and historical trauma, namely from the Balkan Wars. The protagonist has emigrated from Bosnia to Dublin when, after years out of nowhere, she gets a phone call from her childhood friend, which leads them to a road trip, literally from Bosnia to Vienna, and metaphorically down memory lane. So lots of good things going on in this book. First, the author has a way of really delicately depicting mood. The protagonist has always felt like an ugly duckling compared to her friend, who has always been preternaturally suave, mature, knowing, beautiful. And then she really effectively described that combination of admiration, jealousy, and desire. The author also did a really great job depicting how unreliable the stories and narratives we create for ourselves. And lastly, she also did a really great job at depicting how being even a bystander to historical trauma can be traumatic, because the protagonist, in comparison to her friend, she's been spared the most direct, dire effects of the Balkan Wars, yet the book is really effective in showing how poisonous and damaging historical trauma nevertheless has been for her. So all in all, a carefully written, tightly structured, controlled book. I think I ultimately gave it 3 stars because I felt a little bit detached from the story. I feel like if I were more keyed in with the Balkan Wars, I would have gotten a lot more out of it. So really good book. Maybe I'm just not the target audience. So the next book I read is Indignation by Philip Roth, and I loved it. To my surprise, I really, really loved it. I was on guard against Philip Roth because I had read The Human Stain and I had such a meh experience, and I had high expectations because this is the Philip Roth. But then the Korean booktuber Kyoru Sojin recommended Indignation, so I decided to give it a try, and I'm so glad I did. This book is the equivalent of the tape scratch, so you're probably wondering how I got into this situation. The protagonist is Marker Messner, who is a first-gen Jewish college student who ends up in a very waspy college in the 50s. The Korean War is raging on, so he has to make it at school to dodge the draft, and his one stalwart father is suddenly paranoid that with one misstep, Mester is just going to ruin his life. So he's hemmed in all sides. He has to make it. And I think the selling point of this book is that it's a really effective snapshot of the 50s, that time when, before the Cultural Revolution of the 60s, it was like mandatory for even secular universities to have chapel hours, when institutional anti-Semitism was rampant, when like WASP dominance was unquestioned. And the question is, can Messner safely make out of this time and make it to the 60s? But personally, I really like this book because it was such an effective description of being in your late teens and early 20s and being thrown into a new situation and just not knowing what to do. Like, everywhere you look, everyone else has got it figured out. They know what they want, they know how to achieve it. Everyone's comfortable in their skin except you. You're floundering and floundering, and you're wondering how everyone has their shit together. So this book was a really effective description of that kind of feeling. Anyway, I really liked Philip Roth's writing here. I think he was really kind of reining it in, maybe because of the length of the story or the compact nature of it. I felt like he was keeping a tight rein on his prose, and that personally really worked for me. So in the future, I think I'm gonna try his shorter novels and Sabbath Theater, because that's still on my reading list. Anyway, Indignation, loved it, highly recommend. The next book I read is Between Beirut and the Moon by Najib Bakhti. I think it's a semi-autobiographical novel of growing up in Beirut. And as weird as it is to say something like this, I really like Lebanon. I'm easily charmed by things Lebanese, so naturally I immensely enjoyed this book. So the protagonist comes from a middle to lower middle class family, but since his father is a journalist and an intellectual, his parents have invested a lot in his education, which means that the protagonist, he goes to this really swanky private school where he is hobnobbing with fellow students and teachers from different political affiliations, different religions, different social classes, and the writer does a phenomenal job of bringing these characters to life in vivid detail. In general, this is a very humorous book. It's very funny, but this being Lebanon, there are parts about the civil war, skirmishes with the militia. There's this really poignant part about the injustice of people having to emigrate so much because of the political, economic instability. All in all, it's a bittersweet elegiac to Lebanon. So if you have like an ounce of interest in Lebanon, you'll definitely enjoy. So the next book I read is There But Further by Ali Smith. This was my very first Ali Smith book. She is a BookTube favorite here, so I had high expectations, and I'm sorry to say that I'm not sure I liked this book, and I have a feeling that Smith might not be my thing. So let me try to explain. Without a doubt, Ali Smith is a phenomenal writer. She is in full control of her craft. There's this like dinner scene where I felt like I was in the crossfires of a battle. Like, that's how entrancing, how engrossing her writing was. Despite that, in the end, this is a very clever book, and I'm not sure I like clever books. Think Rachel Cusk's Outline or Lisa Halliday's Asymmetry, where I would close a book and say, that was clever. But I wouldn't be sure if I enjoyed this book. I wouldn't be sure if what the point was or whether there is a point in the first place. So again, Ali Smith is a phenomenal writer. Wordplay, dialogue, it's all fireworks. And even still, I don't think I like this book. And I try to understand why, and I think it's because I like my books to be more full-blooded, more involved. But with clever books like this, it feels like the author is a master puppeteer, this omnipotent, detached puppeteer who's placing chess pieces this and there. And it's all very clever, but again, to what point? And of course, Ali Smith, being 1,000,000,000 times smarter than I'll ever be, she had already predicted that I would have this objection, because near the end of the story, one of the characters say, cleverness is great, it's a really good thing when you have it, but there's no point in just having it. So it's like she forestalled my objection. I can't even complain that the book is too clever, because she already predicted and defeated my point. So again, from start to finish, it's a very clever book. And I know saying that something is clever doesn't mean anything. It's like saying something is pretentious. It's thinking more about my attitude to a content more than the content itself. But even so, that is my overwhelming impression of this book. I think I'm gonna read How to Be Both in the future, because I do like reading about art. But yeah, again, I'm not sure Ali Smith is my name. The next book I read was The Antiquities by Cynthia Ozick. This was my very first Ozick, and wow, I was bowled over. What a phenomenal writer. And this was a very quaint read in the best possible way. So the story is the narrative of an elderly trustee of an all-boys boarding school who's recounting his schoolboy days. And I should note that this is not a likable person. He's unrepentant in showing his waspy predilections and prejudices. He's not a good husband. He's not a good father. He's just this very insecure, paranoid man. So this being the narrative of this unremarkable man, by all accounts, this book should be unremarkable. But because Ozick is such a masterful storyteller and she builds tension so deliciously, in reading this narrative of this unlikable man, at some point I went, because I was so fascinated. I don't exaggerate one bit in saying this was a compulsively compelling read. And a large part of this narrative is the protagonist's relationship with a Jewish pupil named Ben Zion Elephantine. And I emphasize the Jewish part because this narrative having been written in the 50s and his schoolboy days having taken place even decades earlier, institutional anti-Semitism was rampant. So Elephantine was one of the very few Jewish pupils allowed at that school. And the protagonist's anti-Semitism is kind of part of the story. Like, despite his relationship with and even affection for the Jewish people in his life, his anti-Semitism is just virulent. It's very striking to see. This is a slim novel, but it packs a punch with really fascinating bits on archaeology, antiquarianism, the unreliable nature of memory, and the fatally misguided Gentile misperception of Jewish identity. It's so good. And there's a very mysterious feel to the novel that I'm not describing well. But basically, if you're looking for something polished and accomplished to the hilt, this is the read. I highly, highly recommend it. I'm definitely going to be checking out more of Ozick's books in the future. We finally come to the last read of the month. I think my English is disintegrating, so please bear with me. I think I'm gonna be reading off my notes a lot. And the book is Katie Kitamura's Intimacies, this summer's hot read fresh off Obama's list. And it was a very entertaining read. I have a distinct memory of reading it while on the exercise bike and belatedly realizing how much I've read it afterwards because it was such a engrossing read. This book has a lot of interesting things going for it at the same time, like how the International Criminal Court works, the kind of Western colonial biases that plague the C system. Also how violence works on both the grand genocidal level and on the more mundane street level. The incongruity you can sometimes perceive between the kind of work a person does and the kind of person they are. There's also a very intriguing romance between the protagonist and the married man. There's a very effective depiction of lust between man and woman, and how sometimes it can easily tip into something more predatory. And the author has a really great eye for that kind of seedy, leery violence men can inflict on women. There's also really interesting ruminations on the nature of language and interpretation. Also, the precarity of adult friendships and how easily friends can dissolve into just acquaintances. Also, the kind of loneliness that comes from being unrooted. So there's a lot of things going on, and I think I ultimately gave it 3 stars because I'm not entirely sure how they all cohere together. As I said, the individual parts were great. And also, writing-wise, there were 2 distinct sections where the writing went something like, there was a contradiction in this moment because these 2 elements contradicted each other, hence the contradiction. Like, the writing went something like this. It is a first-person narrative, but I think the book sometimes got a bit too heavy-handed in hammering down the significance of a moment, which I feel like the reader should ideally pick up on instead of the author having to explain it. So yeah, there were some parts of the writing that weren't entirely smooth in my opinion, but all in all, it was a very solid read, and the reviews for it are unanimously great. So maybe I'm getting something wrong, but yeah, that was the last read of the month. So that was my July wrap up. If you've come to this point, you're a trooper. Thank you so much for watching, and I know it was very clunky, but I promise I will try to get better. Please, in the comments, please talk to me. That's the #1 reason I decided to join BookTube, because I want to talk book with you people. So please let me know if you've read any of the books I've read, if you read any of especially Joshua Cohen's and Cynthia Ozick's books. Tell me what you've read. If you have recommendations, please give them to me. So please talk to me. And again, thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you next time. Bye.